folks in Russia.
Hey, Clyde, really quick before we get started, am I screen sharing the slides today?
No, just the video.
Okay.
That's good. That's good.
Welcome to BIA, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the black community in Canada has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Okay, all right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and start at 11 o'clock promptly. And we're in week 6 of our course, Early History of the African Renaissance from 1896 to the present. This week, we're going to be covering roughly the years 1968 to around 1988. So we'll be doing that 20-year period, and we'll be covering a lot of geographic ground. Our main focuses today will be South Africa, Ethiopia, and Brazil. And again, like I've been saying, when we talk about the African world, Brazil is one of the key areas that we always need to reference. And when we talk about the Americas, Brazil is the most populous country of Afro-descendant people in the Americas. And in fact, when if we were to tally the countries with the largest African populations, including countries in Africa, Nigeria would be number 1, and Brazil would be number 2. This is how many African descendant people live in Brazil. And that's really an undercount, and we'll get into why that is today too. But this period between 1968 and 1988, and the majority of that time being in the 70s, was the time period of the emergence of this conversation around consciousness. Whether we're talking about racial consciousness or black consciousness, class consciousness, when we talk about Ethiopia, and then of course, gender consciousness. Now, that's not to say that the people before this period didn't know that they were black, or didn't know that they were workers, or didn't know that they were women, but the organizing and the struggle around these concepts really heats up in the late 1960s and in the 1970s. So our discussion today is going to focus on how race, class, and gender consciousness led to revolutionary organizing in the African world in the 1970s. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so these are consciousness movements. And the main meeting that we're going to talk about is the founding of the Movimento Negro Unifico that happened in Brazil on June 18th, 1978. So we'll get into the background of why this meeting happened, what came out of it, the Black consciousness movement that arose in Brazil as a result. So we'll talk about all of that today. So last week, where we kind of left off in week 5. Week 5, we talked about Pan-Africanism. We talked about the transition from those early independence movements that were relatively nonviolent to the more violent against settler colonialism liberation movements that would occur in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. We also talked about the threat that Pan-Africanism was to the West and the attacks on Nkrumah, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and others who espoused those ideas. So we kind of left off talking about Nkrumah writing these books that get published while he's in Guinea, books like The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, as well as Class Struggle in Africa. Because these books, written in the late 1960s, anticipate what's going to happen in the African world in the 70s and in the 80s. So our key term for today is Black consciousness. And this term comes to us from Steve Bantu Biko, who we'll talk about in a few seconds. But this is a good definition for this term. Black consciousness is the realization by the Black man, and if you could share this, the realization by the Black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their operation, the blackness of their skin, and to operate as a group in order to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. It seeks to demonstrate the lie that Black is an aberration from the quote unquote normal, which is white. It is a manifestation of a new realization that by seeking to run away from themselves and to emulate the white man, Blacks are insulting the intelligence of whoever created them Black. This was Steve Biko, South African student organizer, revolutionary, and we'll talk about his life in a few minutes. But this is the type of consciousness that was emerging in the late 1960s. There is a qualitative change between the Negro and the Black. It's not just a change in terminology. There's a qualitative change that occurs. And we see it all over the African world where Black folks are racialized, So there's a difference. So Black consciousness is not going to necessarily emerge in a place like Nigeria. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's because Black people aren't racialized in Nigeria. You know, in Nigeria, we have, different religions. We have different ethnicities. We have class struggle. Different people have different classes. But you're not oppressed in Nigeria because you're Black, especially after colonization ended. When there's no white presence, there's no white administrators. There never were large amounts of white folks that were administrators in Nigeria. So you don't have a racialization of oppression in a place like Nigeria. Where Black consciousness does emerge on the continent are places like South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, where in the late 1960s, as the rest of the African continent is getting liberation, is getting free, we're seeing more and more independent countries, the settler colonies are holding on. Southern Rhodesia, Namibia, Kenya gets free and Algeria gets free, but in Southern Africa and then in the Portuguese-speaking territories of Africa, those colonies are still holding on. So we see Black consciousness emerge in those areas. And then, of course, in the diaspora, in Canada, in North America, in Brazil. And again, Black consciousness, we have a Black power movement in the Caribbean, but it's a little bit different than the Black consciousness of racialized oppression. So we'll talk about that, but it's very key to point out the difference qualitatively between the Negro and the African. We're moving into a different way of organizing, a more militant way of organizing. And we see it with some of the people that you might not even expect. We see it with Martin Luther King Jr., who by the time we get to 1967, we're seeing him in transition between this term Negro and Black. Because you have to remember, and I speak to the United States, Black was an insult. It was an insult. So when you wanted to call, when you playing a dozen somebody, you call somebody you Black so-and-so, that Black quality, that made it even more of a vicious insult. But by the time we get to after 1966, when we get the call for Black Power in Greenwood, Mississippi, by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I'll talk more about them in a minute. And if you want to know more about the Black Power era in general, we had a whole class on that. So there's a recordings of that seminar on our course website that I'll show you all when we take our first break, just to remind you all about the resources that are there. But after 1966, 67, Black is starting to replace Negro as the nomenclature for the movement. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you please play that short clip from Dr. King? I just want to show this to show people where his thinking was in 1967.
Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. I said to the group last night, nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Jeffersonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. The Negro is to be free. He must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of numbers and his own emancipation. Don't let anybody take your land from you. Be proud of our heritage. Somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in the dictionary and see the synonym to the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white, it's always something pure. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
All right. Thank you, Daniel, for sharing that. So you see at the beginning of King's speech, he says the Negro this, and then by the end he gets to say it, I'm black and I'm beautiful. That was 67. King would be assassinated a year later in 1968. 1968 was also the year that James Brown released his song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. June 1968. So we're seeing this transition. And again, it's making its way through all the racialized countries where black people are racialized. They're oppressed because of their race. So we're starting to see this Negro to black conversion. Now, in South Africa, so we looked at the definition by Steve Biko. And again, just to reiterate what we were talking about, these different consciousnesses that are emerging in the African world. Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare that Nkrumah wrote in 1968, where he said this final push to decolonize Africa is going to be more violent than the first push. So what we did in the 50s and the early 60s, we're not going to be able to replicate that positive action, those nonviolent ways of getting independence in the countries that are controlled by Portugal and the countries that have the settler colonialism like South Africa and Zimbabwe. It's going to take a different, we're going to have to pay some different dues for freedom. And in addition to that, while we get the settlers out, we're also going to need to struggle against class oppression in Africa. So we wrote Class Struggle in Africa to talk about that, to say we have these internal struggles. We're going to see how both of these play out on the continent. So again, here are the places that we're talking about. Look at Southern Africa. Angola and Mozambique are the Portuguese countries. Namibia is under occupation by South Africa. South Africa, of course, isn't going to get free until 1994. So this is where the struggle is really dominant. And even in Guinea-Bissau, which gets independence in 1974, this is where the struggle is in terms of getting the last vestiges of colonization out of Africa. It's in the southern part of Africa in the 1960s, late 1960s into the 70s and into the 80s. So we're going to focus on the liberation struggle in South Africa. So South Africa at the beginning of the 1960s, the Africans led by the ANC, the African National Congress, which we talked about in week 1. We talked about how Charlotte Makeke was one of the only woman that was there at the founding of the ANC. We talked about the ANC's connections with the wider African world. So we talked about the ANC. And in the early 1960s, the ANC are still a nonviolent organization for the most part. They believe in that positive action, that strikes, that appeals, and legal appeals can end the apartheid regime and end the settler colonialism of South Africa. And just like the rest of the Africans on the continent, they're seeing the liberation explosion happen in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, of course, the whites in South Africa are completely fearful of this, just like the whites, the French in Algeria. They're seeing these African countries get independence, but they know we're a settler colony. We cannot afford to let blacks be independent. So we need to stem this. We need to become more brutal. We need to become more repressive so that the wave of independence that's going all over Africa doesn't reach South Africa. So we have the Sharpsville massacre in 1960. You got Africans protesting against the pass laws. One of the features of the apartheid system was Africans needed to have passes to move around the country. You couldn't move freely through your own country. These pass laws were in place. So a group went to protest, not a group, these are thousands of people went to protest this police station in Sharkville to say, arrest all of us then. None of us have passes, we're here, you can't arrest all of us. It's a peaceful protest, but eventually the police start firing and they kill and wound over 200 people. This protest was initiated by a relatively new group that kind of broke off from the ANC called the Pan-African Congress of Lasagna. The PAC was slightly more militant and not as opposed to armed liberation the same way the ANC was at first. But after Sharpsville, people, both the ANC and the PAC realized that armed struggle we're not going to be able to do what they did in Ghana. We're not going to be able to do what they did in Nigeria or Senegal and get independence through positive action, nonviolent methods. The settlers aren't going for this. So we're going to have to incorporate armed struggle into our resistance. So the PAC was actually first in this regard. And when you see the name Lasagna is what Africans at this time were calling the territory that we call South Africa. Lasagna comes from an ancient name for the region. The first place I saw it, there was an ancient Greek manuscript. I think it was written around, I might be getting my dates mixed up, but it's either the 1st century CE or the last century in BCE. But it was a Greek travel manuscript that talked about this region of Southern Africa, and they called it Lasagna. So this is the name that the revolutionaries in South Africa took. They said, we don't want to call it South Africa. Part of reclaiming our identity and reclaiming our land is reclaiming the name for our space and not having European names for it. So Lasagna. So the Pan-African Congress of Lasagna, they started the Azanian People's Liberation Army, and arming the people became one of their strategies. The ANC as well started their militant wing a year after Sharpsville. The Nkwantu Wazizwe, MK Zizwe is the shortened version of that. But they tried as best they could, at least in the early 60s, going into the 70s, they tried to incorporate more armed resistance, but did their best to try not to kill anybody. So they would sabotage things, infiltrate security forces. They did ideological training. They bombed strategic sites. And some people got killed, but they tried to limit the human death and destruction as much as possible. There's a lot of attacks on infrastructure and things to make it hard to operate the apartheid regime. But of course, as we get to the late 80s, 70s and the 80s, then they realized that we got to even move from that, because after the emergence of this in the early 1960s. And then you see Nelson Mandela, young Nelson Mandela, in the leadership of the ANC and leading these, organizing these sabotages and armed strikes, gets arrested. And a lot of the leadership of both the PAC and the ANC get locked up, get arrested. There's a complete crackdown on Black political activities in South Africa between 1964 and 1965. So a lot of the leadership gets locked up. And a new generation begins to emerge once the leadership is locked up. And they're led by people like Steve Bantu Biko, who was a medical student at the University of Natal, but in their non-white section. Because apartheid, everything is separated. Everything is separated. So even in medical school, you got a medical school for white students, then you got a medical school for the non-white students, which include Blacks, Indians, coloreds, all that. So what Biko is observing in 65, 66, 67, as a student, he's seeing that Black people have become really passive as a result of the arrests, as a result of the repression, and more importantly, as a result of the ideological and educational and curricular domination by the settler regime. So not only are they being repressed physically, incarcerated, killed, tortured, all those things, but our minds are also under constant attack. And he sees this no clearer than in the student movement, which at the universities that he's involved with was led by white students, liberal white students. They have the National Union of South African, I think the National South African Student Union, the National Union of South African Students, but it's controlled by white folks. And Biko is observing this, and he's saying, these white students aren't going to solve Black problems. They're not capable of doing so. And he breaks away. And in fact, actually, Daniel, if you could bring up that video of Steve Biko, because I want you to hear him talk. And this video is from 1977. It's not long before he is unfortunately assassinated by the security forces in South Africa.
Which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by Black people. And for Black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was psychological feeling of superiority. So the NCCA, to be started forming what is now called also the South African Students' Federation, which are fairly big on Black consciousness, the essence of which are for the Black men to elevate his approach by positively looking at those very systems that make him distinctively man. First of all, we said that Black students couldn't participate in multiracial organizations, which were by far white organizations of this country open for white students at university. And secondly, these organizations were concentrating mainly problems which are affecting the white student community, which meant that that organization gave critical opinions which were largely affected by the whiteness of the particular.
All right, thank you, Dale. So the move that Biko and what will become the South African Student Organization did, they separated from the National White Student Organization. And this is 3 years after a group in the US did the same thing. Again, this Black consciousness is spreading throughout the globe. In the US, you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They emerged in the early 1960s as a result of the Black student movement that had started the sit-in movement in the United States. For those of you that are unfamiliar, you might have seen the videos. During the Civil Rights Movement, students decided that they were going to sit in at the lunch counters and refuse to leave until they're served in these segregated lunch counters. It started in North Carolina. Well, out of that movement, the students decided that they want to have a national movement of students that are going to go into the South and fight against Jim Crow segregation and fight for civil rights. And that became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're going to use nonviolent actions like sit-ins, freedom rides, voting registration, all of these things in order to get Black people's human rights upheld in the South. And it was a multiracial organization. But by the time they get to 1965, however, the Black students in SNCC are starting to notice a couple of things. They're starting to notice that when they go into the Southern communities, the white students are getting more, they're all students, all high school, college students, but the white students are getting more respect from the local Black populations than the Black students. And it's because the Black people in the South were so used to deferring to white folks that they were, overly deferring to the white students. They also saw that they were under more danger as a result of the presence of these white students in places like Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama. And white students did die that were involved in SNCC, most famous being Schwerer and Goodman, two white Jewish young men that went down to Mississippi and were killed alongside a brother named Cheney by the Klan in Mississippi and the police in Mississippi. But the blacks in SNCC realized that the presence, particularly of white women and that were in SNCC, was making the white racists in the South even more angry because they just assumed, which was true, because there's a whole nother internal matter, because a lot of the Black sisters in SNCC were getting upset because the brothers were messing around with the young white women in SNCC. So that was the sexual politics of that was something else as well. But at the end of the day, in 1965, it was voted that the whites are going to be removed from SNCC. SNCC has to be an all-Black organization. White folks, if you want to help, the best thing for you to do is go back into your own communities and fight racism there. So instead of being with us in the South and organizing, go to your white communities, because that's where the racism begins. So you go talk to white people. So the same thing happened in South Africa. Steve Biko's looking and he's saying the white student organization, although they say they're on the side of Black folks, they still practice their own form of apartheid. They're still in all the leadership positions in the student organization, and they're not willing to go far enough. So this has to be a Black man struggle. And for Black people, it's important to not be in these multiracial organizations until you develop Black consciousness. Because if you don't, then you'll be in these organizations and you'll feel like a second-class citizen in your own struggle. You'll be deferring to the white students. You'll be deferring to the white liberals. You need to have Black consciousness, which he articulates in speeches, in his writings. As he transitions from being a student, he starts the Black People's Convention movement, Black People's Convention organization, which takes these ideas of Black consciousness outside of the university setting. He's ultimately banned by the apartheid regime. He's forced to go back to his homeland. He's basically under house arrest or township arrest. He can't leave the township. He's banned from the government. He's arrested several times. But before he's ultimately tortured and assassinated by the apartheid regime in 1977, his speeches and writings were collected into a book called I Write What I Like. I Write What I Like. Posted on our course website if you want to read his thinking. But here's one thing he said about Black consciousness in more detail, and I want to show this, if you could share this. He says, all in all, the Black man has become a shell, a shadow of a man, a completely defeated, drowning in his own misery, a slave, an ox bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. This is the first truth, bitter as it may seem, that we have to acknowledge before we can start on any program designed to change the status quo. It becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. The first step, therefore, is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This is what we mean by an inward-looking process. This is a definition of Black consciousness. This is just essentially, I'm not saying, what I'm bringing up is the how different people in racialized settings came to these same conclusions. Because this is essentially what Dr. King was saying in that speech we just watched, when he said the black man has to reach into the inner recesses of his own spirit, I'm paraphrasing, and sign his own Emancipation Proclamation. Nobody can do this for us, what King said. You to stand up with self-asserted manhood. This is the black consciousness that's spreading around the African world. So Biko is organizing around this. He's organizing the masses, him and other folks in the struggle. The sisters in the struggle are also taken up, because in South Africa and in Southern Africa, we talk about Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, the struggle is ramping up in the 60s, and it's a struggle that everybody's involved in. So we move from the sisters that were involved in the positive action in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Senegal, that were using nonviolent tactics like strikes and economic shutdowns, to the sisters that are picking up guns, the same way that they did in Algeria. But now we're talking about Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe. These are the sisters that are in the liberation struggle. These are the sisters that joined the MKZ's way, the sisters that are in the MPLA in Angola, sisters that are in Frelimo in Mozambique. And these images would go all over the African world. Because at the same time that this is happening in the US, you have the emergence in 1966 as well of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And as they grow, particularly after Dr. King is assassinated, so if events like Sharpsville in South Africa and others kind of spur the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, the Black Power movement really grows in the US and then spreads to places like Canada, where we have the Congress of Black Writers, this great event that happened in Montreal in October 1968. And there's a strong Black Power movement in Canada. All of that starts to really blow up after Dr. King's assassinated in 1968. Because when they killed King, they killed the idea that revolution can happen nonviolently. Because if you killed a nonviolent guy, what's our only alternative? So the Black Panthers become a national and then ultimately an international organization. They spread to Australia. There's Black Panthers in India. There's Black Panthers all over. And they are in conversation with what's going on the continent, and they're inspiring each other. Because images like this would appear in the Black Panther newspaper. They would say sisters have to be in the front lines of revolution. We see it in Africa. We see it in Angola, in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Namibia. You got sisters like Winnie Mandela, sisters like Jacina Michel in Mozambique, who is martyred in 1971, who was a medical officer and of course a fighter in the liberation struggle. So you got all this going on. So this is the kind of, again, Nkrumah is writing about this in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. And these organizations are all fighting against settler regimes. And then in the case of Angola and Mozambique, the remnants of Portuguese colonization. Going back to a few classes before, the Portuguese were the first to colonize places in Africa in the 15th century. And they were the last to leave, with the exception of the end of apartheid in South Africa. So, but at the same time that this is going on, if we go further north and east, we get a whole different type of consciousness emerge. And this is that second part of what we're talking about. So the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare is kind of outlining this struggle against the last vestiges of colonization. Class struggle in Africa talks about what do you do when your country is not colonized externally, but there's internal class oppression. We can't act like that doesn't exist in Africa. There has to be a class consciousness alongside this. So the best example of this type of struggle, and I won't go into details, we've done this in other classes, the Ethiopian Revolution. This is the ultimate expression of class consciousness at this time in Africa. Nobody's black in Ethiopia. What I mean by that is this. There's no black consciousness in Ethiopia because people aren't oppressed racially. So if an Ethiopian out inside of Ethiopia is not going to call themselves black because there's no meaning for that. Now, when the Ethiopian students went to the United States, when they went to Europe, they become black because now you're in a racialized situation. So you don't need a black consciousness movement in Ethiopia. What they needed in Ethiopia was a class consciousness movement. You had different ethnicities, you had different religions, but one thing that was very clear was the empire of Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was an empire, had a class dynamic, a very rigid class dynamic and a very exploitative class dynamic, where the majority of the masses were workers, were peasants who worked on land that they didn't own. They were hyper exploited by the landowners, by the government, and in some cases even by the church. As a peasant working on this land, you had to pay taxes to all three: the government, your landowner, and the church. There were a number of famines, which are not natural. And on a side note, we need to be paying very close attention to what's going on in Africa right now, because all the conditions are set for a major famine. Now, there's a big difference between, and I think I've talked about this before, there's a difference between drought and famine. Droughts are natural. Droughts happen. Droughts are the result of, not having enough rainfall and you don't have enough crops grow. Droughts happen. Famines are man-made. They're a result of government failure. And all of the conditions are set for a very extensive famine. Food prices are up because of what's going on with the fuel prices are up, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. So, every time we go to the pump, people look at the gas prices like this is astronomical. Well, that's also affecting how food is transported places, because when fuel prices go up, everything goes up, including food prices. So food prices have gone up. A lot of Africa's grain is imported, so that's being affected. And then you have a drought as well. And then on top of that, you had a war in Ethiopia that's just starting to slowly wind down. So all of these are the ingredients for a famine. So we need to be on the lookout for that and figure out any ways that we can kind of support this thing before it gets out of control. But anyway, they had a famine in Ethiopia in the 1960s and 70s. There was a few. So in 1973, there was a famine. 1974, there was mutinies in the army. The army wasn't getting paid enough. There was all types of problems with the junior officers. There's a teacher strike in February 74. There's a taxi driver strike in 74. The prime minister ends up resigning because the empire tried to make some concessions, because there was a coup attempt in the 1960s. So the empire tried to make some concessions, a new constitution, a new political system, but ultimately it didn't work. The prime minister resigned. In March 1974, they tried to make some more constitutional amendments, but the people still aren't pleased. There's a student movement that's going on. We talked about the student movement in our last seminar on African student movements, and Ethiopian students abroad and in Ethiopia at the university in the capital are organizing and debating these questions around class and worker struggles, as well as ethnicity and nationalism in the empire. In 1974, you get a Muslim rally with 100,000 Muslims in Ethiopia that are rallying for religious freedoms. And then the junior officers in the army officially form what's called the Derg. It's a collection of junior officers that have a revolutionary spirit that want to change things. And then ultimately, September 12, 1974, the emperor is deposed by the military. And the students and the workers are all, happy about this, because one of the things the military does in the next year, in 1975, they initiate land reform. So all these people that had for generations been working on this land that they didn't own now get to have control. Well, the state officially controls the land, but the people in theory at first control the state. So the land is in the hands of the people. They're not being overly taxed. There's no more landlords. The church has been put to the side. So they're not forced to pay tithes to the church. And it's a true revolution in Ethiopia that goes from an empire to a socialist system controlled by the military. Now, it starts off good, But ultimately, though, the Derg becomes just as repressive as the empire eventually. Even the students that initially backed the Derg, there's a red terror in Ethiopia. A lot of things go haywire. But what it does show is that the people will uprise against internal oppression. This was class struggle. This was the workers and the students of Ethiopia saying, we're not going to be oppressed by an emperor anymore, or the royalty in Ethiopia and the landlords that are in bed with the emperor. So this is the highest expression of class struggle in Africa, class consciousness that happens in the early 1970s. So we'll stop for a second before we move across the Atlantic and go to Brazil and talk about what happens there and talk about who this gentleman was. So Daniel, are there any questions in the chat, or do folks have their hand up to ask any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Dr. Ledbetter, I would like to find out who is responsible for security internal in South Africa. Is it a white person, a white minister in charge of the military and security?
Right now?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I don't think so, but the ANC had a very unfortunate event happen in 2011 or 2012, but either 2011 or 2012, you had the Americana Massacre, where there were workers protesting against a platinum mine, and they were gunned down by the police. And this was under the ANC. So we're going to talk about either next week or the week after what has happened with the ANC since the 90s. And that was very reminiscent of some of these massacres during apartheid. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was a black person. So now South Africa has moved from, there's still a need for black consciousness in South Africa, but it's really starting to become more of a class struggle in South Africa as well, because you got black folks that are on top that have, really adopted this bourgeois mindset. And so I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I am almost certain that when Nelson Mandela became Prime Minister, there was some arrangement for the sharing of power, and there was a white officer who was in charge of security, military, and otherwise.
You're right. That in 1994, you're right. I'm not sure if it's still like that today, but definitely in 1994 there was. Yes. Any other questions or comments with this part? Anybody else? I don't see any hands. Okay, so we'll move on. Before we do, I just want to bring this up. Daniel, if you could, please show the course website on the screen. I just want to, before we go into what we're talking about, I just want to remind folks again that please utilize the course website. There you'll find all the recordings of our sessions, this is the third year that we've had this class, so there are recordings from previous years, and none of them are the same. So last year we went more in depth about Ethiopia and some other places, so you can find that information. You can find the readings that I've mentioned to get more in-depth information on all the topics that we've talked about. And not only for this class, but for other classes that we've run. It's all there. It's all free. So please utilize it. Again, like I always say to you guys, I don't want you to take what I'm saying as the gospel truth. Please do your own research. It's there. This is just part of it. You can use these sources as a jumping off point to collect other sources, but I always encourage you to do your own independent research on these things. And you should do that with anybody that talks to you. Make sure that there's resources to back up what they say. So I just wanted to put that out there again. Please utilize the course website, look at the materials. And Daniel, if you could, if you have it, if you could put the link to this in the chat. And if you don't have it available, I'll put it in at the end of class. So thank you for pulling that up there. All right, so we're moving across the water, and we're moving a couple of years further. Brazil, 1978, April 28th, 1978. Robson Silveira de Luz is tortured and killed by the police in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is a name that many of you might not be familiar with. You probably never heard of Robson Silveira de Luz before. I know I hadn't before I started studying Brazil. But essentially, this was very similar to the George Floyd moment that we had in 2020. Very, very similar to Trayvon Martin or anybody else that's killed by law enforcement or people that want to be law enforcement or that type of thing. It galvanized the Black Brazilian population. He was a taxi driver. He was I think he worked at a bar with his father, and he stole fruit, a box of fruit from a vendor, and was hunted down for days, captured, tortured, and then killed to leave behind a wife and 2 small children. His wife was pregnant at the time. I think one of the reports is when they were looking for him, they took his wife and handcuffed her while she was pregnant and all types of things. Tortured and killed him over a box of fruit. A box of fruit. So this was not the first, and it definitely wouldn't be the last killing of a Black Brazilian by the security forces in Brazil, by the police in Brazil. In fact, in 2022, the numbers are outrageous. We talk about Black Lives Matter. There's a Black Lives Matter movement in Brazil, which when you look at the statistics about how many Black people are killed by the police in Brazil, it makes what's going on in the United States and other places like it's nothing. You know, you got police in Brazil that go into apartment complexes and shoot up dozens of people, Black folks. So this one in particular, as well as another experience in the same year, 4 Black youth in, I think it was also in Sao Paulo, were removed from a volleyball team because they were Black in Brazil. So we have 4 young Black men on this volleyball team. I think they was associated with this country club, and they were removed from the team because they were Black. So all of these things and all of the other racial discrimination all came together into a new Black consciousness movement in Brazil in 1978. Let me go back a little bit and kind of set the scene. So like we talked about before, either in this class or in classes previously, Brazil is the country in the Americas with the largest population of African descendant people. In fact, like I mentioned at the beginning of class, if we were to line up all the countries with African populations, Nigeria is number 1, Brazil is number 2. In the 20th century, so Brazil was also the last place to abolish slavery. Slavery wasn't abolished in Brazil until 1888. When slavery was abolished, Brazil looked at its demographics and it realized that the majority of the people in Brazil were of African descent. But Brazil decided that they weren't going to be like the United States and the other places and allow one drop to make you Black. Brazil has a very, very complicated racial dynamic. But all you need to realize is Black is at the bottom. White is at the top. And in between, you have mulatto, they have all types of names, Café con leche, Pardo, Maroon. They got all these different names, but as you get lighter and closer to white, your privilege in society gets higher. And in fact, it's so strange that your skin color plays a key role, but it's not the only consideration. Money is a consideration. So you got somebody like the great soccer star Pele, who for all intents and purposes, looks black, but in Brazil, because he had money and fame, was considered white. It's really a strange dynamic. So the way that you, where you're at socioeconomically, where you're at culturally, depending on if you practice an African religion or not, you can be considered more black or more white depending on where you're at in life. But ultimately, though, if you are considered black, you are at the bottom. In the 20th century, Brazil did a couple of things. They didn't have any of these laws on the books. Brazil presented itself and used this term racial democracy to describe what they were. They said there's no racism in Brazil. We don't keep any stats about who's black and who's white. We're all Brazilians. There's no laws on the books like the United States or South Africa that say blacks are banned from here, blacks can't go to school here. Everybody there's no laws like that. We're a racial democracy. But any visitor that goes to Brazil realizes very quickly that although there are no laws that say blacks can't be here, this is the actual reality, that there are schools that blacks can't go to, that there are clubs that blacks can't get into. There are certain jobs and professions that there's no black representatives. There's no blacks in the government. There are no blacks on the media. You could turn on the news in Brazil, even up into the 80s, the 90s. You could turn on the TV in Brazil and not see a black face unless they're in a subservient role as a maid or something like that. All the news anchors are white. Everybody talking is white. All the commercials are white folks, white Brazilians. So you would think that you're in Europe or something. And Brazil tried to make itself so through a quote unquote whitening process in the early 20th century. Just like Canada, actually, Brazil had a very restrictive immigration policy. They only wanted people to immigrate to Brazil from Europe. They actively recruited Europeans to come to live in Brazil. The same way Canada, tried to make it so that they had a restrictive immigration policy that if you're black, you can only come to Canada to work, and we're only going to take limited numbers, and we want immigration from Europe, not from Africa, not from Asia, from Europe. Same thing that they did in Brazil. The myth of racial democracy that Brazil had set up for itself spread throughout the world. People actually believed this because they weren't actually visiting Brazil and weren't actually living there. But the blacks in Brazil knew that this was a falsehood. In the 1930s and 40s, you get a lot of black movements. Obvious Nascimento with his theater company and promoting black culture emerges. But by 1964, there is a military coup in Brazil, a military coup that is supported by the United States. We talked about the coup that the United States supported and helped operate in Ghana against Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. We talked about how the United States and the CIA assisted in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But this wasn't, Africa wasn't the only place the U.S. was operating. And more readily, the U.S. was operating throughout what's called Latin America, including Brazil. So in 1964, they had an election in Brazil, or a year before, they had an election in Brazil, and a left-leaning candidate became president. The business interest in Brazil and their connection with the business interest in the United States said, we can't have this. Because the fear of the United States during the Cold War was that this region would become socialist. They would follow the example of Cuba with the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So the U.S. wanted no more Cubas. So anybody that had any left-leaning politics in any of these places, the U.S. felt it was their duty to ensure that a capitalist-leaning group that would support big business, that would support U.S. business interests in all of these places would be in charge. And in the case of Brazil, that happened to be the military. So all this talk about the United States upholding democracy, there are so many democracies, elected governments that have been overthrown either directly by the United States and people that were trained in places like the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, or others throughout this entire region. We talk about Bolivia, we talk about Chile, we talk about Argentina, Colombia. A lot of these right-wing groups were supported by the U.S. So the Brazilian coup happens in 1964. It's blessed by Lyndon Johnson. On our course website, I put up the link to the recording because all this stuff is declassified now. So what I'm telling you is not conspiracy theory. It's not, oh, here we go with that black revolutionary stuff. Everybody's against. No, this stuff is declassified now. So the CIA, the FBI, we're talking about internationally. So the CIA, the U.S. military, the presidency, all this stuff, these records are available. So you can hear Lyndon Johnson being briefed about what the U.S. is going to do to support the coup in Brazil. So an elected government is overthrown by the military with U.S. support in 1964. Whether they were an elected government or a military government, up until this point, the governments in Brazil supported this myth of racial democracy. And they supported the marginalization of Afro-Brazilian people. 1964 gets even more repressive. Between the 64 and the end of the 1970s, the military passes a number of laws. One of the laws saying that you can't talk about racism. You can't talk about racism. They limited the ability for people to organize around anything because the military realized when people organize, then they're more likely to challenge military rules. So they tried to outlaw political organizations of as many as they could. But people still resisted. Even the blacks that went into exile during the military rule continued to resist. And a new movement grew up in the 1970s because while this military regime is happening, Brazil, the black Brazilians are still, developing and organizing, and they're also being influenced by what's going on in the United States. They're also being influenced by what's going on in the Portuguese-speaking parts of Africa. They're seeing what's happening in Angola. They're seeing what's happening in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, and they're being influenced by it, and as well as their own internal, development. During the years of military rule, we also are seeing, which really started in the early 20th century, the growth of the favelas. Favelas are the ghettos of Brazil. But they make the ghettos of North America or anywhere else look like paradise. I mean, these are places that are incredibly overcrowded, no services like in terms of plumbing, limited electricity, limited sanitation, all of these things. People living in makeshift homes made out of cardboard and tin cans and all types of things. And they're living there. And some of the leadership that comes in the black movement of Brazil comes out of these places that are in Rio, in Sao Paulo, in some of these major towns. So 1978, Robson DeLuz is killed by the police. Those four brothers are kicked off the volleyball team, and black leaders, black students from Sao Paulo, from Rio, from Bahia, they all get together and they say, we need to form something. We need to start something. And in Sao Paulo in June, they have a big demonstration. And they come up with the United Movement Against Racial Discrimination. That's the first name of this movement. Where the black folks are saying, we are going to challenge the military regime. Because it's still a military, now it's starting to loosen up a little bit. The military regime itself is going to be ended in 1980. So political space is being opened up again. And black people are taking this opportunity to organize amongst themselves because they say the white movement that's also fighting for democracy in Brazil, but as they're fighting, they're refusing to address racism because, again, they believe in racial democracy, that there's no racism in Brazil. So as white folks are struggling for democracy and a return to civilian rule, the black folks are being alienated because and this is the majority of the population. So if we really look at it, Brazil is not that much different than South Africa. Now, it's not an overwhelming majority, 90% of South Africa is black. Brazil, it's probably closer to 65, 70, even though official documents say it's 50% black, that's a low count. It's probably closer to 60 to 70% black. And there's no laws like the apartheid laws that say black people have to be here, black, but in all reality, in all measurement, it's very much similar to South Africa. The black majority has been marginalized. So they're saying, as we move toward democratization, we need black people to come together and we need a black consciousness to unite us, to make black not a bad thing. Because just like in South Africa, just like in the United States, black was the lowest of the low in Brazil. To be black was to be completely ostracized. So they're saying, no, we love being black. We love our African culture. And we're going to organize around that. So they started the Unified Movement against racial discrimination in June 1978. One of the first things they did, so they met a few times over 1978. 1978 was also the year that Brazil was going to celebrate the 90 years since emancipation. And if we go back, he's killed April 28th, 1978. Emancipation Day in Brazil is May 13th. May 13th, 1888 is when slavery ended. So May 13th was going to be these big celebrations about 90 years since slavery ended. But the black activists said, no, that's a government created holiday when the government decided to end slavery. But black people had been resisting enslavement since they were first brought to Brazil. So for the black activists, they say, we don't want your May 13th because it means nothing. Because on March 28th, you just killed and tortured one of our brothers. And he's not the only one that's been killed by police violence in Brazil. He's not the only one that suffered from economic marginalization, political marginalization. So many black Brazilians aren't able to complete their education. So many black Brazilians aren't able to make full use of the resources of the country. So why would we celebrate May 13th as Emancipation Day? No, Emancipation Day for us, National Black Consciousness Day, is going to be November 20th. Is going to mark the martyrdom of one of our great leaders, Zumbi of the Palmeiras. Zumbi was the leader of the Quilombo, the African war camp, war community, nation in Brazil called Angola Janga, or Little Angola. This was a community of escaped Africans who had escaped their plantations, escaped the mines that they worked at in Brazil, made their way, formed their own community that combined different African cultures from Central Africa to West Africa. They even let in poor whites and indigenous Brazilians to form this community that existed for 100 years. They fought against the Dutch, they fought against the Portuguese, and they were able to resist and form this nation, this confederation of quilombos. The quilombo is a Central African term meaning war camp. So they existed, and we've talked about this in other classes, these communities that existed throughout the Americas. But this was the largest one. Zumbi was killed by the Portuguese on November 20th, 1695, I think it was 1695. But November 20th became their holiday, and now it is the official National Black Consciousness Day in Brazil. The official holiday of Afro-Brazilians is November 20th. So they said, forget May 13th. It's kind of like the black folks in America forcing the government to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And again, all these things, it's amazing what black people have to sacrifice to get little things like holidays. Juneteenth wouldn't have become a holiday without the death of George Floyd. So many of you that work in different spaces would not have equity and diversity things on your jobs and your companies without the murder and recorded murder of George Floyd, assassination of George Floyd. Same thing in Brazil. You know, the National Consciousness Day and all these things, black people have to shed blood for just the simplest of recognitions. We have to give up so much. So they decided to do this. And then later on in the year 1978, they changed the name from the Unified Movement Against Racial Discrimination. They said, no, we need to put black in this. So they became the Movimento Negro Unificado. That's in Portuguese. So the United Black Movement. So Negro here is not the Negro that Dr. King. Negro is black in Portuguese. So the United Black Movement. And they changed the name officially in 1979. The United Black Movement gave us so many great political figures in Afro-Brazilian history. From these meetings, they decided this organization was going to build struggle everywhere. They were going to create centers of struggle wherever black people were. So if you were a black student at a university, and at this time more blacks had started to enter Brazilian universities, those would become centers of struggle. You organize around blackness at the university. On your job, create a center of struggle where you organize with other black workers. If you are in the Samba organization, you know, Samba, the great Brazilian dance, Afro-Brazilian dance, that's the center of organization. So it wasn't just political, it was also cultural. centers of struggle, religious centers of struggle. Candomblé, the Afro-Brazilian religion that comes from West Africa. Umbanda, a Central African religion that has West African elements that's transported, that's created in Brazil. That became a center of struggle. So all that was the building blocks of this movement. Wherever you are is where the struggle is essentially the message. Wherever you are is where the struggle is. There's a lot that we can take from this. There's a lot that in 2022 that we can take from this. The struggle is wherever you're at. One of the key elements, and I'll end with this, so about 10 more minutes. While this struggle was unfolding, another form of consciousness was also emerging. So we've talked about racial consciousnesses, and in Brazil, racial consciousness is tied up with class consciousness because, like we said, the working class, the proletariat in Brazil is made up of the Afro-Brazilian people. There's a class element embedded in the racial consciousness as well. So they're organizing as Black, they're organizing as workers, and they're also organizing along gender consciousness. Because the sisters in the movement are saying, while we're doing all this, one other thing we also need to fight against is this idea of machismo. This idea that Black men always have to be in charge. This idea that the sufferings and the oppression of Black women based off their particular type of oppression, being Black, being workers, and being women, needs to be addressed because it's not being addressed in other movements. There was a Brazilian feminist movement that refused to talk about race. And in the early parts of the Black consciousness movement, many of the brothers decided that, oh no, we don't need to talk about gender, that's divisive. And the sisters are saying, no, we suffer from forms of oppression that you don't suffer from because we are Black women. And this was the same conversation that was going on in Africa in the liberation movements, as those sisters were picking up guns and joining liberation struggles in Angola and Mozambique and in South Africa. They're also challenging gender norms that were exacerbated by colonization, that this is not a space for women. They're saying, no, you're going to fight for the country. We're going to fight for the country. We're going to fight for liberation. Particularly as more and more of you men get locked up, who else is going to pick up the struggle? So if I got to tie my baby to my back and have an AK-47 in my other hand, hey, that's what we got to do for freedom. It's a very famous image that's in one of the Black Panther newspapers. I think it's a sister from Angola with that. But the sisters in the United States were saying the same thing in the Black Power movement. You guys are talking about kill the pig and off-whitey and all these things, but we still have this gender oppression in our community that we need to talk about. This is where sisters like Angela Davis, sisters like Assata Shakur, sisters like Elaine Brown bring this gender dynamic, this gender conversation into the Black Power space. Because they're not, again, just like in Brazil, there's a feminist movement in the US, but they don't want to talk about race. So the sisters in Brazil, people like Beatriz Nascimento, who was a historian, one of the founders of the United Black Movement, and an activist, a poet. She had a documentary that she wrote and narrated that was directed by somebody else, but it's called Ori. It's called Ori. You can find it on YouTube, but it's in Portuguese. I haven't yet to see an English translation of it, but it's one of the most important documentaries of the Afro-Brazilian experience. And she talked about the importance of not limiting the idea of the Quilombo to a historic reality, to expand this idea. The Quilombo didn't just end when slavery was over, but wherever Black people were organizing, that was a Quilombo. That was a war camp. That was a place where Black people resisted. So she said Quilombo is a social condition. It's not just the place where Africans lived as they were resisting enslavement. It's a social condition, fundamentally a social condition. A grouping of Blacks by Blacks who were never accepted by society. It's the acceptance of Black culture. So she moves the conversation of the Quilombo from, oh, that's something that happened during enslavement, to there's Quilombos, the favelas are Quilombos. These are places where Black people don't have titles to these land, they're building these houses, they're forming community, they're forming Quilombos. The Black students and student organizations at university, those are Quilombo spaces. Anywhere where Blacks are resisting oppression is a Quilombo space. Again, she was a great activist, a great artist. And her death even reminds us about the various forms of oppression that our sisters are sometimes under. She died protecting one of her friends from domestic violence. Her husband was beaten on her. She intervened, and she got killed in 1995 as a result of that. But again, just like she writes and she talks about African spirituality so much in her work, particularly a documentary Ori, she still lives on. Nobody's gonna remember the name of that abuser that killed her, but we will forever remember the name of Beatrice Nascimento. And in the African tradition, her spirit lives on her because we'll never forget what she did. But it's important on us and that are taking classes like this to use her work, her understanding of the Quilombo, her understanding of Afro-Brazilian culture, and tell other people about it. And I'm trying to incorporate more Afro-Brazilian things into our conversations because it's like I mentioned at the front, it's irresponsible to talk about the African world and not talk about Brazil. You're not telling the full story. So we got to get more Brazilian content into our discussions. Another Nascimento is different, not related. Adias Nascimento came up with the idea of quilombismo. So again, they're all operating out of using the model of the Quilombo as an organizing principle. And this Nascimento wrote in 1980, it is for the Black people of today to sustain and amplify the Afro-Brazilian culture of resistance and affirmation of our truth. Quilombismo is a method of social analysis, comprehension, and definition of a concrete experience. Quilombismo expresses scientific theory, a scientific theory that inextricably welded to our historical practice that can effectively contribute to Black people's liberation from centuries of an inexorable extermination. Quilombismo. That is the political mentality, that is the Afro-Brazilian term for the Black consciousness movement in Brazil. To be a Black activist in Brazil is to be a quilombola, is to practice quilombismo. One other great thinker that we all should know is another scholar, activist, another one of the co-founders of the United Black Movement, which was Layla Gonzalez. And you see her there with the great scholar and activist Angela Davis from the States. But Layla Gonzalez, Angela Davis often goes to Brazil, and she's invited to speak because she's one of the most well-known Black scholars in the world, from her writings on gender, on prison abolition, so on and so forth. But when she goes to Brazil, she says, I don't know why I'm here talking to you when you have Layla Gonzalez's work. She is who I look at when I want to learn about particularly the experience of African descendant women in Latin America, because she writes this great text about feminism among Afro-Latina women, saying that you have to have a race and class analysis when you talk about gender in the Latin American situation. If not, it's incomplete. And she's writing this largely to white feminists who are saying that, womanhood is not just white womanhood. And you can't just copy and paste the white women's struggle on what Black women are doing. You have to have race consciousness. You have to have class consciousness. So Layla Gonzalez gives us all that. She writes a number of books. She's active. She actually dies of cancer in 1994. But again, I'll put her work on our course website, some of the articles that's written by her. You can read about her and other Black Brazilians in a book called The African Presence in the Americas, edited by Carlos Moore. This is a very good book that came out of a conference that happened in the late 80s where Africans from Guatemala, Brazil, Mexico, a couple of places get together. There's articles in here by Ami Césaire, Maya Angelou, and others, Leopold Senghor. So this is a good text that comes out of that conference. Last person I'll mention, whose book that I've been reading, so while all this is going on, I'll go through this pretty fast. The liberation movements are still ongoing. The Africans in Brazil are in conversation with what's going on in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese Africa. And also, you have Operation Carlotta happens in Angola. And this is going to spell the end for South Africa, apartheid in South Africa. The Africans are still struggling against apartheid, the different movements in South Africa. But South Africa is also trying to uphold Portuguese colonization and also neo-colonialism in Angola. So the South Africans actually back a group of Africans. So Angola gets independence in 1975 from Portugal. But there's a struggle for who's going to control Angola. Is it going to be the revolutionary MPLA, or is it going to be one of the Western-backed black groups that are going to be supported by South Africa and the US? So there's a civil war that happens in Angola. By the time we get to the 1980s, the revolutionary elements of Angola are starting to get support from Castro's Cuba. Cuba has a long history of supporting revolutionary movements in Africa because just like Brazil, so much of Cuba's population is Afro-Cuban. And their interactions in Angola were called Operation Carlotta, named after an enslaved African woman that led a rebellion in Cuba named Carlotta Lukumi, meaning she was from Southwest Nigeria. Lukumi was the name that they gave to Yoruba people in Cuba during the period of enslavement. So Operation Carlotta was the name given. They said, we're going to name it after this enslaved black woman that led a rebellion in Cuba. So the Cubans are in Angola, and Cuba doesn't have a lot of resources at this time, really, but they're committed to revolutionary struggle and helping other people get free. The South Africans are backing one of the other groups in Angola. Civil war is happening. Ultimately, the Battle of Cuanavale in 87, 88 defeats not only the Cuban-backed Angolan troops, defeat the South African-backed Angolans and the US-backed Angolans. And this defeat, as alongside the internal armed struggle against the South African regime, as well as Namibia getting free from South Africa with SWAPO, Zimbabwe getting free in 1980, Mozambique getting free. South Africa is now surrounded by free African countries that are no longer going to stand for the apartheid regime. So by the time we get to the 1980s, it's not because of the US no longer supporting South Africa or the British no longer supporting South Africa that the South Africans decided, well, I guess maybe we should negotiate with Mandela and get him out of prison and negotiate with the ANC. It's because they were being enclosed. They were being enclosed by these free African countries that were ready to militarily put an end to apartheid. So it's then when they realized, okay, we need, the gig is up. If we don't want a bloodbath, we need to start negotiating. So all that to say, this is all occurring in the 70s and 80s. But going back to Brazil, the last thing I'll finish with is Benita De Silva, and this is her with Nelson Mandela. She is the representation of all of what I was talking about with Black consciousness, class consciousness, and gender consciousness in Brazil. Benita De Silva was born in the countryside, but her family moved to a favela when she was very young. She wasn't able to complete her education. She was a victim of economic abuse. She was a victim of sexual abuse. She lived in extreme poverty. She was able to get into politics through the neighborhood associations in the favelas. She worked, she raised her children, but she kept organizing, fighting for the rights of poor people. Until ultimately, when democracy came back in 1980, she's involved in moving from neighborhood associations to being a member of the Workers' Party, the PT in Brazil, the Partido, I can't remember what it is in Portuguese, but it's the Workers' Party. Ultimately, she goes from being a member of the neighborhood associations to being a representative of the party on the city level to being the first Black woman elected to Congress in Brazil. Then she becomes the first female senator in Brazil by the time we get to the late 1980s. Then in the 1990s, she becomes the first governor of a state in Brazil, the state of Rio in Brazil. All of this from a woman who worked as a domestic, who worked she was a street child, so meaning she had to drop out of school and earn her living working on the streets in the favelas. She never left the favelas. Even when she became a congresswoman, she continued to live in the favelas. Even though people said this is very dangerous, you shouldn't live here, she continued to live in the favelas. She's still alive today. She wrote this book in the late 1990s, the autobiography of her life, and it's in English. You can still find it. It's called Benedita, an Afro-Brazilian woman's story of politics and love. And Jesse Jackson actually wrote the foreword to this book. At the time in the 1990s, Jesse Jackson was a big deal. I mean, I don't know how much Jesse Jackson is today, but he still is. But everybody thought Jesse was going to be the first black president. It didn't turn out that way. But anyway, Benita De Silva. And in the book, she talks about fighting for women's rights, fighting for the rights of workers, and what it means to be an Afro-Brazilian, how you can infuse that culture and that Quilombo spirit into fighting for these things. And then, we see her with Nelson Mandela in the 1990s to show how interconnected all of this is. So we'll stop there for today, because what we'll get into next week is we'll talk about the late 80s and the 1990s in the African world. And we'll focus on what happens when we can officially say colonization is over, what other struggles still remained. And then after that, our final week in week 8, we'll talk about the time period from around 2010 to the present. What's been going on, where we're at, and what does this idea of African Renaissance look like right now? So we'll stop there today. We'll take a few questions that will be recorded, and then we'll turn off the recording for a general open discussion. So Daniel, is there anything in the chat?
There is, but really quick, did you want me to screen share that third video too?
No, that's okay. Yeah, we don't have time for it.
Okay. Olene, I hope I pronounced that right.
Yes, good afternoon.
No.
I just wanted to clarify, Clyde, you said there was a book that was entitled Ori, which I'd like to actually get the name of the author.
Ori, it's not a book, it's a documentary by if you type in Ori in YouTube, it shows up. It's only in Portuguese though. You could put the subtitles on, but it really doesn't match. But you can get the spirit of it, even if you're watching it in Portuguese. It's still worth looking at. It's called Ori.
Okay, but because Ori is actually a Yoruba term to your spiritual head.
Yeah.
Which also refers to your destiny, your inner self, and you basically can't receive any blessings or do anything in life without the blessing of your Ori, and your Ori is what allows you to be a driving force in your life instead of a spectator. So instead of things happening, in the whim of things happening to you, you can be a changer and make things happen. So that is the primary principle.
That's it, and that's exactly. And that's exactly what that documentary is getting at, because Beatriz Nascimento was a initiate and a proponent of Candomblé. So this is her love letter to Afro-Brazilian struggle and also Afro-Brazilian spirituality. And she goes, in the documentary, she goes back and forth from Africa to Brazil. That's exactly what she was getting at. So thank you for letting people know. So again, folks, you can find it on YouTube. Just type in ORI, and it will come up. Other questions? Any questions in the chat, Daniel, or anybody with their hand?
Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lippman, I think it was very interesting that you mentioned America's concern with the exporting of socialism into South America. Mm-hmm. I remember in 1983, just before they invaded Grenada, Ronald Reagan that the airport on the island was one of the longest airports in the Western Hemisphere because this was going to be used as a military base from which Russia would be able to launch its operation. And yet for all, after the revolution, America actually had to lengthen the runway in order to accommodate commercial flights.
Yeah, it's I mean, and thank you for mentioning that. And also on our course website, in this week's readings, I did put up a collection of speeches by Maurice Bishop, because during this time period, that's another key thinker that you should know. And I didn't mention Thomas Sankara. I'll mention him next week, but this is also happening during the 1980s as well. But I think I talked about these, at least Sankara in the previous lecture. But I'll mention them again next week because it ties into the 90s as well. But yeah, it's the absurdity of it, the absurdity of the whole thing. And they still haven't found those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq either. So still waiting on that. Pradeep, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Good morning. I think it's afternoon actually, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm just wondering, because how many people are there in the class right now? A lot of people coming. I'm just wondering what the situation is there. I would like to come there, but I just don't want to be in the class over there.
Yeah, you might be. There's nobody here today. I think people have really gotten comfortable watching this live. So we don't have anybody in the classroom. We haven't had anybody in the classroom the entire time.
Also the next out of town actually for going to Europe for next 3 weeks maybe.
Okay.
So but I try to attend from there. I would not like to miss if I can.
Yeah.
But coming to the point that you made about because commentary about the black man being a vassal, like an empty vessel, not the vassal, empty vessel. I think that was in most colonies. It was ingrained in the local population, even in India. That the local population is there to serve the European master, basically, right? So in the education system and in the social structure, it was all meant to be service to the people who were ruling at that time. So over time, the young kids became ingrained in that from the time they were growing up. And it has become very difficult to overcome that. Even today, independent countries, that still persists, right? And even I think, my opinion, and I think maybe some people agree, is that today's structures, international structures, kind of foster the dependence of those countries on the European countries and institutions. So any movement towards total self-sufficiency is not easy. So you have all these migration outflows, which make it that look like people are literally begging to be taken out of their country, and you see these Mediterranean, ships in the Mediterranean sinking regularly in the summer and all that, right? So I think it's just perpetuating the same thing that was there in the colonies. And I think it's in a different way though.
That's it. You're right. And it's all about freeing the mind. I mean, that's Steve. If you read I Write What I Like, the most thing he's talking about is the consciousness of the mind. How do we free the mind? How do we use, he particularly talks about African history to rebuild the African personality. He quotes Sekou Touré, he quotes others. This is the key. And this is something that's been talked about throughout this period, is freeing the mind. And that's that's what these classes are about. That's what we kind of do. So thank you for that. With that, we're going to turn off the recording. We'll meet again next week, and we had a few minutes for open discussion if there's any announcements that folks want to make. One I would like to make, there's still tickets available for Jaku Convent's Father's Day event. So on Saturday, June 18th, I think tickets are about $30. So come, that includes a meal, some entertainment. You honor your father figures in your life. So please purchase your tickets. And I'm not sure that you can call Jaku Convent. Go on the website. You can call Jaku Convent and get your tickets. And there might at this point be an Eventbrite page. I'm not sure, but that event is coming up. So please, if you're interested, check that out. So any other discussions or questions that folks have, and the recording is off. The recording's off, so feel free.